In this, our third week, we're going to be talking about how to do writing in the AP classroom. I think this is such an important skill, and I do know how tough writing can be for students. I think there's a reason for this that I'll get into in just a minute about, what's the difference between writing when we think of things being like mathematical versus things being interpretive. But here's what I would really strongly suggest, and I'll just tell a brief story about this. For me, when I was in high school, I was not a good writer. I thought I was, but I really wasn't. It took me until about my sophomore year of college to actually become a good writer, and now I do consider it to be a real skill. How did I get to that point? The biggest part of it really is diving into the process. The more engaged and passionate you get about ideas, the more you're going to find that as you read and as you are working on your passionate engagement with ideas, the better of a writer you're going to be. And that's what's really going to turn the tide for you. So if you consider writing to be one of those struggles, just know it's natural and normal for that to be the case. But that will change over time as you start to understand the elements of writing. But this is the big thing that I've got to stress on this. It's so important. I think this is hard for a lot of students to understand. Writing is not math. You cannot expect that writing is going to be like a formula. Writing is more of sort of like an art. Like the way I want you to think about it is to think of it like a recipe that a chef uses. If you ever ask your parents if they cook, or if you know somebody who cooks, or maybe you cook, you kind of know the way that it works. Any recipe that you have, you start with the rules, and you've got to make sure you have the right measurements and the right elements within your recipe. But eventually what you find out is that actually you can change up the recipe a little bit. There really is no one way to add all these ingredients in. And in fact, the really good chefs and cooks know that when you take the elements and you start playing around with them and putting in new types of elements, you create these new fantastic things that people can eat. And that's the same thing for writing. In writing, you have all the ingredients, but you need to combine and add a few new elements and give them more depth. So the way I want you to think about what we're going to talk about from here on out is that writing is not a formula. It's much more about criteria or elements. And here are the big criteria that come up with anything that you're ever going to write. Having a strong thesis statement, supporting evidence, good analysis, and coherent, well-organized arguments. So that's the overall elements. Now let's get into each one of these and talk about how you can construct them in a way that makes good writing. So first off, with a thesis argument, whenever you're writing, you want to try and have a main argument that you want to get across, especially when you start to get into arguing in an entire essay. The purpose of a thesis is really to provide a specific sort of umbrella argument for the entire argument. So, this is one of the things I think students find very confusing a lot of times. A thesis is not the repetition of a prompt. A thesis is not the repetition of all the arguments that you make within the essay, but rather a thesis is a general argument that you're going to make that combines together all the other arguments. This means that a thesis cannot be either too vague or too narrow, which I know is really tough. How do you walk the middle ground off of that? So a thesis must include the following things: claim, warrant, and impact. So a claim, what's your overall opinion? Warrant, what's your support or what's your reason? And then the impact significance. Here's an example. Let's say you have a prompt that deals with modern societies and how they developed with energy. Okay, modern societies discovered new forms of energy that allowed for cities and the development of economies that mass-produce goods for large markets. Notice here we have a clear claim that's taking place about modern society's development. We have a warrant or a reason. The reason is new forms of energy. And the impact is the economic effect. That overall this has allowed for the creation of these new large markets that produce a lot of goods. So I want to add a layer onto this and talk about what's called the historical thinking skills. History is different from math, it's different from English, it's different from science. And because of that, we have our own ways of doing things in history in which we interpret and ask questions and analyze things. And we do that with these thinking skills. And the big thinking skills for you to remember are comparison and contrast, cause and effect, change and continuity. So really quick off of this, comparison and contrast means that we take either two time periods, or we might take two societies, two groups of people, and we say, what's similar and what's different between these groups. Cause and effect. What is the cause that leads into all the different types of consequences that happen in society? And then change and continuity. In every society, there are changes that take place over time, but at the same time, there are patterns of continuity that take place. You can kind of think about this for your own life. If you think about the time since you've come into Loyola High School, my guess is there have been some big changes that have taken in your life from freshman going into sophomore year. But there are also continuities, right? I mean, continuity of your family, the continuity of just going to school on a regular daily basis, the continuity of maybe the sports activity that you take place. All of these things have both changed your personality as well as remained continuous in your personality. So every prompt you're going to face is going to have 3 elements to it. So whenever you have to write, history teachers like myself, we are going to give you what's called a prompt. In the past, you may have heard of it called a question, but it's called a prompt. Prompts are always going to have 3 parts to them: the hot, historical thinking skill, the content, and an impact or significance. So you got to look for one of these: comparison and contrast, cause and effect, or change in continuity. Then you're going to make an argument based upon the content, and then it's got to have an impact or a significance. So how do you know about the impact or significance? I would suggest remembering this acronym, and this is going to work for you regardless of what class that you take within AP World History or within the humanities. Think of SPRITE. The acronym SPRITE stands for Social, Political, Religion, Ideology, Technology, and Economics. In the end, every prompt that you're going to face is going to ask you something along the lines of a historical thinking skill, content, and then the impact is going to be either one of these or a combination of these, where you're going to have to make some argument about like how things impacted social and religious issues or political and ideological issues. Maybe it's just one of these, it's going to be economic issues, but it's going to ask you about these impacts. And it's really important that you find that and make sure that your thesis argument addresses that. So next up is supporting evidence. You know, whenever you give an argument, you can't just provide a thesis argument or a topic sentence or just a general argument. You got to make sure that you support it with evidence as well. And I think this is really tough for students, and I get this because, you know, one of the big questions, you know, in math, we kind of know if you just do the equation, you're going to come up with the right answer. I mean, I always think of, for me in math, the quadratic formula, right? If I just follow that quadratic formula, I will get to the end result. But in writing, it's not like that. In writing, I can't tell you like how many examples you're supposed to have, how much data actually works. To some extent, you have to make a sort of judgment off of this. So how do you know when that judgment is okay? Well, I would suggest the following guidelines to help you out with that judgment. First of all, is the example significant? Okay, now what do I mean by significant? Well, when it comes back to it, does it really allow us to answer the prompt? Does it allow us to support our thesis? Now, here's the good news about that. That means you don't need to provide every possible detail out there. You know, this is one of the big things I struggle with students at the beginning of the year in AP classes. They look up on Wikipedia and they're on all these other different sources and they want to find out every date and every number and they never know when to stop. And my response is you didn't need to do all of that. All you needed to do is think of what are the big examples we talked about in class, and you want to use those. And again, that gets back to significance. What information helps to answer the prompt? Now, here's one thing I would suggest, and I know this is going to sound contradictory. I just said I can't give you a number. I'm going to give you a number. But this is not a number as in a sense of like an absolute number. This is what we call rule of 3, which probably would be better calling it guideline of 3, in which you are going to think to provide 3 specific examples that you think are going to back up the argument that you're making. And then you want to make sure, as usual, that when you use that evidence, the evidence is stated in a way that addresses the thinking skill, the hot, and the SPRITE impact. So when you're writing an essay, when you get out of just a body paragraph, you know, what should an essay look like by the time you're done? Well, an essay is going to have the thesis argument, then it's going to have a body paragraph. And the body paragraph should start off with a topic sentence. Don't jump right into your details. Don't jump into examples. Don't jump into specifics. Give a topic sentence. The topic sentence is going to be the main argument that supports the thesis. Then after that, you want to provide a rule of 3 significant examples. Make sure when you do this that you give a brief description of the example. And you want to give the most significant details. How do you know it's significant? Because it helps to back up your thesis. It helps to back up your answer to the prompt. And remember, you want to then provide some kind of analysis. And the analysis should be along the SPRITE impact of the argument. So I'll give you an example of what I look for in an AP World History class. And just keep in mind, it is the summer here right before AP World History. So a lot of the stuff that I'm throwing in here, students have learned about in my class for a good week or 2 weeks before they write something like this. But this is what eventually I'm looking for. So let's just say for a moment that we had something like from out of our readings about how the Industrial Revolution got going and what were the significant economic impacts. Here's what I would look for off of that. Industrial countries have created cities that employ labor for the creation of large urban markets. Now notice what I've done there in the first sentence. This is a topic sentence. It gives me a good general argument about how people are moving to cities and creating these vibrant urban markets where people are going to be working, right? So that gives me that general argument that still is somewhat specific, allows me to start off the paragraph. Now, here's my evidence. England began to use coal deposits to demand more efficient forms of energy. Coal deposits, very specific. It's allowed factories to develop for the purpose of creating mass production of cloth. Good. There's a specific example of mass production of cloth. Farmers saw an opportunity to raise the standards of living, so they moved into cities in England. There you go. People moving into cities, very specific. This new labor force used the energy of machines in the cities to boost the industrial economy, create a new consumer market. People are buying things. There you go. Specific example. Here's our impact. The result of that modern economy has been more trade between countries. There's my Sprite economic impact I'm looking for. So hopefully from what you see in this paragraph, there's a specific topic sentence. There's at least 3 pieces of evidence in here, and the evidence is briefly described to be significant, and then you get that Sprite impact about the increase of trade. So I want to add on another layer of complexity to this, and I know this is going to be kind of tough because we've already done so many things, but analysis is so important. And analysis really does fit into Sprite analysis, but there's another layer to it. And if you can get this down, trust me, it's going to help you out so much, because what we do most often in history is that we analyze arguments, okay? And here's how we do that. Point of view. So point of view is not bias. That's the popular way everybody likes to talk about, is that, somebody's biased. Well, everybody's got a bias. You can't escape from that. The question really is about, how does somebody's position in society impact their argument? So here's how we do that with point of view. We ask, first off, what is their attribution? What's their social status? What's their gender? What's their race? What their national origin? Religious status? What's their argument? But what we want to look at is, how does the attribution or social status impact the argument? And then last off, what is the impact to that? So now we're back to Sprite, okay? How does this argument, what's the agenda behind the argument? And why is their social status influencing that? Next up is audience. Who is the author appealing to? We all know that we change our arguments based upon who our audience is. My guess is you do not talk to your parents in the same way that you talk to your friends, and there's a good reason for that. You're not going to talk to me as a teacher in the same way that you're going to go hang out with friends. Even amongst your friends, if you go out with your friends, you're probably going to talk in a different way than if you're out on a date for a dance. It's probably going to be really different. Why, right? Why? Are you somehow being insincere? No, it's because you have a different audience. And so you want to address that audience in a different way, but that means you have a different purpose. That's what the last point of analysis is. What is the argument saying versus what the argument doing? Purpose means that we are looking to see what's the agenda behind an argument. What is the purpose behind the argument, not so much what is the person saying in the argument. I'll give you an example. So here's a poor example of what I wouldn't want you to do with analysis. The leader of the United Nations has said that the North Korean leader is a danger to global security. Now notice what I've said there. The leader of the United Nations has said, well, this is just paraphrasing then what he said, right? He said the North Korean leader is a danger to global security. It's just a paraphrase. But here's an example of analysis. The leader of the United Nations promoted the unity of major superpowers in opening talks between the North Koreans and the Chinese to stabilize Southeast Asia. There are actually 3 points of analysis here. The leader of the United Nations is our attribution. Promoted the unity is the purpose, okay? And our audience is a superpower. So notice what I've done there with the analysis. I've actually done 3 types of analysis off of this statement. And notice that I'm not so much saying what the leader said, but what was the agenda he was after that was underneath what he was saying. So, of course, this always gets people's questions off of this. How much do I really need as far as all this stuff goes with evidence? Like I said before, there's no formula for the right amount of evidence. One of the pieces of advice I can tell you, though, is this. When a teacher talks about a major example over and over again in class, you know that's an important example. You need to fit that into your argument. You want to make sure you prioritize examples that best illustrate the argument you are making. Okay? And you want to try and use examples to help you to describe with smaller examples, so you actually get to fit in more information. Remember, your point here is not to write about everything. What you're trying to do is provide specific and significant examples. It's going to help you with the prompt and the thesis. So here are my big takeaways this week that I want you guys to consider. First off, always remember, a thesis argument has to address the historical thinking skill, higher order thinking skill. It's got to address historical content. It's got to address the impact, the Sprite impact. Make sure you provide significant but brief examples. So that's rule of 3. And then last off, when you do argumentation and when you write argumentation, you want it to be an analysis, point of view, audience, or purpose. And please remember, writing is hard. It is not easy because writing is not a formula. And so it takes time to go into depth. So the more you practice it, the better you're going to get at it.